I'd like to welcome everybody here today. I'm John Corcoran, the Executive Director of the American Rose Society. So glad you decided to join us on this Saturday. Before I get started, some of you might be curious of what's going on in Shreveport, Louisiana. You've been watching the national news. I will tell you that the American Rose Center is doing okay. I was out there on Tuesday and on Friday. It was treacherous when I had to drive out there on Tuesday, very slow at 10 and 15 miles an hour. The Rose Center, as of right now, had no busted pipes that I could see. I'm not sure when we turn back on some of the water, I'm sure we'll have a few busted pipes here and there. But as of Friday, there was nothing collapsed or anything else. So luckily, we went through this snowstorm pretty good in Shreveport, Louisiana. I never thought I would say we'd have a snowstorm. However, some of our employees haven't been so lucky at their personal residences. But we're thankful that everybody is safe here in Shreveport, and we have internet and electricity. Some of us don't have water, but that's a whole different story. But we're glad we're here to be able to talk about roses and have a good time for the next hour and a half. With that, I'd like to hand the program over to Kim Merritt so she can go over how things are going to go today. Kim?
Thanks, John. Welcome, everyone. I just want to go over the flow of today's seminar. We will have Ms. Kathy Brennan introduce our speaker, Mr. Mark Wyndham. Mr. Wyndham will give his presentation on insects and diseases. And then once the presentation is over, we will go into the 30-minute Q&A session. It's very important, if you are watching this seminar with someone else, please post in the chat pod who you are watching with. Even if you logged in with both names, still post it in the chat pod for me so we can make sure we have you all noted properly. Okay, so thank you all so much for attending, and let's go ahead and get started. Ms. Brennan?
Yes, well, most of us have had the pleasure of knowing and hearing Dr. Mark Wyndham speak on insects and diseases, but the ones who have not will certainly enjoy and will not forget him after today. Dr. Wyndham is a distinguished chair professor in ornamental pathology at the University of Tennessee, where he has been there for 35 years. He has received many awards on his researches in plant health, mostly on flowering dogwoods, azaleas, hydrangeas, and the latter rosette, which affects us with our roses. Dr. Wyndham is a devoted husband, father, and grandfather. Very proud grandfather, and he should be. I, with that, give you the pleasure of hearing Dr. Wyndham. Sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, we're doing rose and insect diseases again. And for those that will be taking a CR exam, let me explain how this presentation is going to work. You need to be watching for the little red rose by bullet point. The example I have is, if you see a slide, which you won't, that says Mark is a plant pathologist, Mark is a goober, you see the rose. So that means on the CR exam, there's going to be a question like, Mark is handsome? No. Mark is intelligent? Definitely no. Mark is a goober? That's the correct answer. That matches with the rose. Mark is a Tom Selleck lookalike. He wishes. So the bottom line is, watch for the little red rose. And I think the next slide has two of them. So what is IPM? IPM is basically a system where we do monitoring. We couple a combination of cultural control methods as needed, and we do this in an eye of disrupting the environment as little as possible. The base of any IPM pyramid is going to be prevention and education. If you're doing education today, without education, you don't know which steps to take next, whether it's cultural, host resistance, sanitation. The higher you go on the pyramid, the more intensive things become. At the top of the pyramid, the thing we want to use the least, if we can get by with it, would be pesticides. And in the case of pesticides, you know, insecticides is probably the most dangerous one we use, because insects are certainly more closely related to humans than are fungi. You know, some insecticides are nerve toxins. Well, humans and insects both have nerves and nervous systems. Fungi, bacteria do not. So an insecticide, when we use it, we want to use it only when we have to. And when we do use it, we want to use the least toxic, effective one. Now, looking at insects, one of the most common problems on roses is aphids. Guys, we're off the hook. All the aphids are female. There are no males. Damage is usually mild, but it can be severe. And if it becomes severe, we can have distorted buds. Leaves and buds can also be covered in honeydew. Honeydew is the clear, sugary excrement of the aphids. It can turn brown or black with different fungi growing in it, and it's very sticky. Aphids, there's different ways that we can go about controlling them. We can wash the insects off with a water wand. That works if the infestations are not too severe. If we have to, we can step it up with insecticidal soap, which is a soft pesticide, but you have to cover the aphid. There's no such thing as spraying the insecticidal soap and hoping that the aphid walks through it. That's not what it does. It covers them in a soap film, and then they suffocate. That's a good thing. So severe infestations may require us amping up to a chemical like orthene. And this would be considered, from an IPM perspective, the last resort. One of the things that's real interesting to me is stem and cane borers. Where I live in Knoxville, there are often small sweat bee type bees that bore down in the canes, but they can be wood boring beetles as well. And there are some little wasps that can do it. The bottom picture there is a stem that I split years ago in my own yard, and there were a few dead metallic bees in there that just had not made it out, couldn't get out. And there you see the larvae, and the green that you see is the pollen that the mama put there when she laid the eggs, and that's what those larvae are feeding on. Now, borer damage can be mild, it can be severe. This is a house in 2019 in West Tennessee, and the bushes had been practically destroyed by rose cane borer damage. And but we have to understand that these little bees, when they are the metallic bees, they are important pollinators. Now, on roses, as Rosarians, we consider them archdemons from hell. But even though we do, we have to understand that we don't want to hurt any kind of pollinator. So instead of trying to kill them, we want to discourage them to go somewhere else. If I lived next to Kathy Brennan, I would try to discourage them from my house and go to hers. And so the way that I'm going to do that is every time I make a pruning cut, that is on a cane or stem that is the size of a pencil in diameter or bigger, I'm going to cover it with some type of wood glue. Now, You can use exterior wood glue, it'll last longer, but I found just regular wood glue lasts long enough. It doesn't have to persist the whole summer. It just has to persist on that cut long enough for that soft pith, that white center of the cane, to harden off. And once it gets hard, the bees are going to look for something softer to bore in. Now, the next insect, this one is also a demon from heck, are chili thrips. Chili thrips are invasive. They're from Asia. They have a large host range, including many ornamental species and vegetables. And unlike flower thrips that we are used to, chili thrips feed on foliage and can cause wrinkled and brown leaves and very distorted buds. Now, there are a number of insecticides that are labeled and recommended for chili thrip control, and it is important that if you are in a location where there are lots of chili thrips, that you rotate insecticides to reduce the chance of insecticide-resistant issues. Because with thrips, that is always an issue. Now, chili thrips can show up anywhere. You can go online and you can find maps where chili thrips are located. A couple of years ago in Nashville, we had a landscape that had severe chili thrip damage. We went to some box stores that were nearby and found them on roses that were for sale. It did considerable damage to the landscape, but the chili thrips did not overwinter. And TDA destroyed the roses that were at the box stores. So we were able to minimize the spread of this thing, and we were able to get by it since it wouldn't overwinter. But there's always the possibility that these things could adapt and move northward. We've seen that with fire ants, haven't we? So I have no comfort to give. You need to be constantly on the look because this thing can move in the trade. Flower thrips, something we all happen to deal with. They're usually more noticeable on lighter color blossoms, but they cause a browning of the petals. They can re-enter beds from flowers and weeds. Insecticides are often not necessary, but they might be necessary. Flower thrips can be hard to control. If I'm having a problem with flower thrips, I'm probably going to go in and just debud or take all the blooms out of my garden at that point. If I'm having a lot of problem with it, and start over and wait for the next flush and get rid of them. Japanese beetles. Diane Ackerman once wrote, I don't mind Japanese beetles having sex on my roses. I wish they wouldn't eat at the same time. Frank L., who is a good friend of mine and an entomologist, goes, you know, they're just multitasking. Isn't that what we're all supposed to be doing today? So he seems to think that they are okay things. I do not. The Japanese beetle we see is only out as an adult feeding on roses a very tiny part of its life cycle. Most of the time it spends its life underground as a grub, and these are those big white grubs that you find if you start digging up some sod in your yard. And there is a product called milky spore that you can use, but I have never found it effective. Oh, it will control the grubs in your yard. But the beetles, when they emerge, just come back in from your neighbor's yards that haven't used milky spore. So unless everybody's going to use it, and that's not going to happen, I don't really see where that's beneficial. Now, there are some products that are sold. For goodness sakes, avoid the Japanese beetle traps. And there are some chemicals you can use for these. Some that you can put on your hose, some you can spray. I don't do any of those things. The best way is I have a small bucket that holds a quart of water, but I only put about 2 inches of water in my bucket. Mine has a handle on it. The one in the picture does not. Japanese beetles have the unique thing that when you disturb them, they don't fly straight off. They're going to drop about a foot and then fly. So if you hold your bucket below where they're at and you just tap it, they will drop into the water. Now, if you have put a drop or 2 of dish soap in that water, you have broke surface tension, so they can't float. They sink, and then they drown. And, you know, there is a misnomer that Japanese beetles attract other Japanese beetles. That's actually not true. What happens is the feeding of Japanese beetles attracts other beetles. So what's attracting them is plant volatiles that are released when they're feeding. So we want to minimize feedings of the first ones. Now, because of my work with roses, and I work with many thousands of roses during the summer every day, when I get home in the evening, I really, after being in the field for 8 to 10 hours, I really don't feel like doing a lot of deadheading. So the number of roses in my yard has dropped considerably, but will go back up when I retire. But when I was at a max, I only had about 250 to 265 bushes. And it would take me no more than 10 minutes at the peak of Japanese beetle season, when I was getting lots of calls from people how their gardens were being eaten up by Japanese beetles. I didn't have a problem because I would walk through the garden in the morning just after sunrise with my little bucket, and if I saw a beetle, I would hit it, it'd drop in and drown. And I would do that in the evening, just a half hour or so before sunset, and doing it twice a day like that, I had practically no damage to my roses, which meant I wasn't attracting very many beetles. On a good day, I might kill only 3 or 4, where some of my friends who were not so fastidious with this and were not doing this on a routine basis, their roses were being eaten up. So, and there is one other advantage. You know, at the end of the day, you've got dead beetles in that little bucket of water. Some people would dump it out and put fresh water in. I don't. I want the new ones when they drop in and they're struggling, trying to survive. I want them to see the corpses of the dead ones below them so that they will know what their fate is. I have no pity for Japanese beetles. Rose midges. This is a toughie. This one is hard to control. Its range is spreading. It's northwestern U.S., Midwest U.S., into Maryland, into Kentucky, moving south. This is one that is a difficult one to control. The midge, of course, is a type of fly, so we don't have larvae, we have maggots, and they can really cause a distortion of flower buds, and they blacken the tissue. And of course, what are they damaging? The thing we really want, beautiful roses. Controlling rose midge can be difficult. Timing is exact, and that's hard to predict. Buying bare root plants helps prevent movement of maggots in the soil. That's often where they are. If you've had severe problems with rose midge, you can certainly reduce your populations next year by for 2001. Right now would be in Knoxville or Shreveport, late fall, or winter. We want the maggots to be in there overwintering. You can remove and replace the mulch. That would be extremely useful because they're overwintering in the mulch. Or if that's impractical, you could come in and put 3 or 4 inches of mulch on top. That won't stop some of them from getting through as adults, but that will stop most of them. Most of them would not be able to crawl through 3 or 4 inches of new mulch. Rose slugs, which are sawflies. There are 2 different, well, it's actually 3, but we're going to talk about 2. The bristle rose slugs, which are on the top of the leaves, the curled rose slug, which is on the bottom of the leaf. Often when people contact me about rose slugs, they contact me, the damage is there, the holes are in the leaves, but the slugs are gone. And because what happens is they feed, and when the little maggots get large enough, they will then drop off the leaves, pupate on the ground, and then we'll get new adults again. So they often are not seen, and of course they're about the same color as the leaf. They're actually clear, but as they eat the leaf, they take on the color of the leaf, and this makes them very hard to see. Contact insecticides will help if you can catch them. Scale insects, round or oval. They can be black, they can be gray, they can be white. When they're in the state that you see, well, if you look in the top picture, those big white discs, that's not what you're trying to control with the insecticide. Do you see those little bitty white things that are, say, just to the right of the form? They're near the top of the stem, and those are the little instars. That's the first, that's what they look like when they first hatch and come out from under those skin coverings. And that is the stage that you got to catch them at if you want to be effective using insecticidal soap. There's also some growth regulators. In some states, they are legal for homeowners. In some states, they are not. So you have to check the label, check with your county's extension service to see if they are legal where you are or if they are not. Leaf cutter bees. Leaf cutter bees, their damage is spotty. They make perfect little circles in the leaves. It's been my observation, they usually come back to the same leaf until they pretty well torn that one up before they move to another one. They really don't do enough damage to impact rose vigor. And we got to be careful with these little things because they are definitely valued pollinators. And with all the trouble that we're having with honeybee populations, we need every pollinator that we can get. Spider mites, nothing redeeming about these. They're not insects. They are more related to spiders than they are insects, but they are a mite, and they're going to suck the juices from the rose leaf. They usually are found on the bottom of the leaves, and they're found during the hot times of year. And they, if the populations build up high, we may even get webbing, and I hope it never gets that high for you. But if it does, or you notice spider mites on the back of your leaves, the one that's most common is a little tiny thing, but it's got 2 black spots on it. It's called a 2-spotted spider mite. A hard blast from a water wand directed at the bottom or back of the leaves. Spraying the top of the leaves doesn't do you much good at all. But if you can get the blast to the back of the leaves, you can knock those little critters off. And they're so tiny and they don't have wings. But if you knock them off, the odds of them getting back on another rose leaf in their lifetime is almost impossible, is impossibly low. So you can really control them with a blast of water. Really and truly don't really have to use pesticides if you stay on it. There are root weevils for our friends that are on this webinar from Florida. They have invaded Florida from the Caribbean. They have a wide host range, including palms. The adults feed on the flowers. Now that's bad enough. But where they really do their damage is the larvae can feed on the roots, and they will girdle the roots, and they will destroy the root system, and the canes will die. Now, these things have been found now as far north as Jacksonville, Florida. I have had a couple of reports for them in southern Georgia, but I haven't been able to confirm them. And so this is something that folks who live in the deep south really need to be watching for. The weevils are pretty large, as you can see on that rose bloom. So this is something that should be relatively easy to detect. It's going to kill your roses. And so then finding the weevils, yeah, you should be able to detect that. One thing that is more of a curiosity than anything else, it is found in some Western states. It's very common in Europe, is robin's pincushion gall. And you can see what it does. It gets its name from the English pixie, Robin Goodfellow. And there's a picture, a drawing of Robin Goodfellow and down in the bottom. And the reason why is this little wasp that makes it is blown from one location to another in the wind, the way they would imagine a little pixie to be blown in the wind, I guess. And so anyway, that's what it looks like. Now, what's interesting is it's sort of spectacular when you see it out west. It's usually on species roses, not cultivated roses. But this thing in Europe has been used for all kinds of things, treating colic and toothache. The gall ashes can be mixed with honey to prevent baldness. It's too late for Baldo. He should have smeared his head with gall ashes and honey a long time ago. You can put them under a pillow to induce sleep. I haven't tried any of those, but if anybody does and it works, I'd love to know. Now, we're going to move very quickly into diseases. The first one we're going to mention is powdery mildew. There is a difference between symptoms and signs when you talk with a plant pathologist. If what you are seeing is a host response to disease, it's a symptom. If it's the physical presence of the pathogen, it's a sign. And the only reason why I'm telling you that is it makes the slides a little easier. The signs of powdery mildew are the white powdery fungal growth that you see on the leaves. The leaves will blister up and twist and become distorted. They may turn red. Those are all symptoms of powdery mildew. Now the spores, this is important to remember when we get the black spot. The spores germinate in periods of very high humidity. Now how high? They don't germinate in less than 92% humidity. So they're going to be germinating in really high humidity, but they will not germinate in free water. So very warm, very high humidity, this is where we're going to find powdery mildew. Now there's different ways of controlling it. Sanitation, raking and destroying infected material. Some of the leaves will drop off, rake them up, get rid of them. Prune and destroy symptomatic foliage. Promote good air movement. If we can have good air movement in our bushes when we prune them in a way to promote good air movement. If you do so, the humidity will be less within the canopy of that rose. There are a number of fungicides, if that becomes necessary, that are labeled for homeowner use, and I mentioned some of them there on the slide. Now, black spot. This is one that many people have to deal with. We have spots that are on the surface, but look at those spots. They do not have discrete borders. They sort of get fuzzy at the edges, and they sort of feather or smoke into the edge of the leaf. The leaves may turn yellow and drop off. There can be raised purple-red canes on the stems that may be very insignificant in appearance. And that's one of the places that the fungus overwinters. Now, leaf wetness is critically important for infection to occur. In fact, black spot spores require a minimum of 6 hours of being in water, free water, water drops. They have to be wet for 6 hours before they will germinate. The spores are dispersed in splashing water. They can be spread by people by getting them on us. You know, if we're dealing with foliage that is wet, we can move the spores around. There was a lady in the county where I live. I live on far west end. She was in the far northeast end. And she sent me some leaves and said, "What is this? I've been growing roses for 20 years and I've never seen it." It was black spot. So I drove out to her house wondering how could she not have seen it. Those were the oldest roses I think I had ever seen in my life as for a whole garden. And she had never had it. She lived in a pasture, and as far as you could see, it was just low grass and cows. There was no one around her. But her children had given her 2 new roses, and she had introduced black spot into her garden. And when I told her what she was going to have to do from now on, she started crying because she had never had to do any of the things that I'm going to talk about. Now, black spot is going to overwinter on fallen leaves. It's one of the things she and I talked about, and also on stems. Now, I mentioned the 6 hours of water that's needed. And this usually happens at night. These are some leaves that were sent to me asking what was wrong, and it was black spots. You can see the lesions with diffuse borders. But when I looked at those leaves, you could see where water had stood on the leaves. And that's exactly where the black spots were. You know, when I held those leaves and when they cup up a little bit, wherever the water would be sitting on them, that's where the spots were. Alan Hinn, one of my colleagues at Mississippi State, real good friend, and he and I have published together. He put this little chart together, and it is sound. And that is that we don't recommend watering between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. in the evening. We also don't recommend watering in the morning. And you say, "Well, Doc, the afternoon, it's so hot. That's when if we're watering." And I say, "Yeah, but here's the whole key. Whenever you water, you need to make sure that there's going to be an hour between the time you water, the foliage dries and you water in the morning, or if you water in the evening, the leaves are going to be dry for at least an hour before dew starts to form." Now, a lot of people use soaker hoses or drip irrigation, and they say, "Well, we shouldn't have to follow this." Well, I use a lot of drip irrigation on many thousands of roses, and there is always one of the first things we have to do every day is walk to see what emitter has malfunctioned. And now we have a little stream coming up, and we have wet foliage. You see, that only happens to happen once, and you're in trouble. Black spot is unforgiving, and the spores most likely are sitting there. And when they get wet for 6 hours, well, okay, you're in trouble. There is resistance. Many years ago, there was lots of claims for resistance, and frankly, it was not true. Today, I'm proud to say that when a rose company today says something is resistant to black spot, it actually is. But we do have a problem. It may be resistant where they tested it, but we now have different genetic races of the pathogen, and some of these races can overcome some of the genes for resistance. So what is resistant in one area may not be resistant in another. And if you constantly are getting new roses, you may introduce a new strain of the black spot fungus into your garden. Another problem might be is due to the environment. Some years black spot pressure is low. These are usually years when it's dry. In wet years, even some of the resistant ones may be showing more spots than what you want. But you can see resistance. This is that picture's from an old black spot trial that I had many years ago in Poplarville, Mississippi. I also had it in Crossville and in Jackson, Tennessee. And there is my girl, one of Ping Lim's roses, sitting next to my control piece. Every third plant on every row was a piece rose. And this let us know that we had severe black spot pressure in the trial. And this is in late August. And you can see my girl looks pretty doggone good with absolutely no spraying, but look at peace sitting next to it. So resistance is one way that we can certainly use or eliminate pesticides. So what do we want to do? Keep the foliage as dry as possible, promote good air movement, sanitation, pick up the foliated foliage. Now, before this started, Kathy was talking about picking up weeds without having to bend over. This is the only time you should get anywhere near your roses with a leaf blower. But in this case, you're going to put that other tube on it, the really big tube, and you're going in the bag, and you're going to turn it into a vacuum. A wet dry vac will do the same thing. You can suck up those dead leaves. Okay, you might suck up a little mulch too, but you ain't going to miss that little bit of mulch. And you can suck those leaves up without having to pick them up or rake them. Fungicidal sprays on a regular schedule, and there are many fungicides that are labeled for black spot. I usually don't list them because some come and new ones come and old ones go away. Cercospora leaf spot, take a look at that. The spores have a discrete border, but they look a lot like black spot, really, especially when the black spot lesions are young, favored by hot, humid weather. This has been a problem mostly in the humid, hot southern states, but it is beginning to spread as many parts of the country seem to be getting warmer. It's controlled by the same fungicides. Resistance is available, but let me point out something. The genes controlling resistance to Cercospora leaf spot are not the genes causing resistance to black spot. So you can have a rose that is resistant to black spot that will spot up with like a leopard from Cercospora leaf spot. I've had many people fuss and send me symptoms. This rose is supposed to be resistant to black spot. Why isn't it? And when I look at the leaves, it's Cercospora. It's not black spot. Downy mildew is another thing on the foliage. Causes usually red, maroon, purple, sometimes almost black, usually angular lesions. And angular is because they're limited by veins. If you turn them over, it's very hard to see, but there'll be faint white patches underneath those lesions on the back of the leaves. This thing is incredible. The spores can just germinate in just a couple of hours. Plants can become symptomatic in 3 days, but they may even start to drop their leaves before they show symptoms. You'll see in the next slide in a minute about how severe defoliation can come if you're in a very cool but humid environment. Downy mildew does not like warm weather. It's going to be bad between about 55 degrees Fahrenheit and about 72 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to overwinter in stems and roots. And this is a picture of a wholesale nursery that had roses when he detected symptoms on day 1. He took a picture of his thing, but he didn't call me. He's in the county I'm at. He didn't call me till day 3. And that's just 2 days, the bottom picture, after he took the top picture. Incredible. In a conducive environment where the humidity is real high, like in a hoop house, cool temperatures, you can see what happens, and it can happen so quickly. So what are we going to do about this thing? Well, we want to try to move air in and around roses as best we can. Prune them to that open vase shape. That's good for black spot. It's certainly good for downy mildew. We want to avoid any kind of overhead irrigation. You can't avoid rain, but we don't want to help things along. We want to inspect new roses in the spring when you buy them. If you've had problems with downy mildew, sanitation is critical. If you've got it on some bushes, strip them. Strip all the leaves off. Start over. Prune it back. Get rid of that as well as you can. There are 2 excellent fungicides for downy mildew. Now, downy mildew is not a true fungus, but what we use to control it are considered fungicides. And for homeowner, agrofos and mangazeb, it's not the man-made fungicide that does it. It's the zinc that's attached to it that is controlling the downy mildew. But both of them are very, very effective. If you have someone spray your roses, or you're a landscaper, or you have a commercial license, there are other things that you can buy, but these things are so expensive. Certainly, I've always had some problems with downy mildew at my house, but I'm not going to buy those things. And I have a commercial license, but I just buy agrofos and mangazeb. Usually I'm buying mangazeb. It's the first spray I use for black spot in the spring. And the reason why is it's also controlling downy mildew. So I get 2 bangs for 1 with that, and it works very well. And Anthracnose. Anthracnose looks a lot like Cercospora leaf spot, but there is a big difference. If you take a little magnifying glass, or you have much better eyesight than I do now, so I use a magnifying glass, and you look inside, look at those spots on the tops of the leaves, you'll see what looks to be little flecks of black pepper. Those little flecks of black pepper that's on inside those lesions is actually the fruiting bodies of the fungus. Now, Cercospora, it sporulates, but it sporulates on negative hyphae, so you won't see those black flecks inside the Cercospora lesions like you do with anthracnose. There's another key. Anthracnose is going to occur when it's cool. This can happen in the deep south, like New Orleans, if we're not losing all our foliage. They can have anthracnose on it. When I have visited gardens in Delaware and Pennsylvania, even Blowing Rock, North Carolina, which is relatively cool compared to Knoxville, if I see a lot of anthracnose in the spring and early summer. In warmer regions of the U.S., anthracnose will not be a problem in the spring and summer because it gets hot too quick, but you'll have Cercospora. So that is another way you can tell them apart. Now, we look at these, real thing to remember: black spot, diffuse borders, anthracnose, defined borders with those little black pepper flecks in them, Cercospora, defined borders, no flecks of pepper, and downy mildew, angular leaf spots. And there are some other differences. Remember, Cercospora, warm and humid, and anthracnose, cool and humid. That's 2 that's hard to sometimes separate. When we move on to other things, petal blights and things like that, botrytis blight. This is the big one of the reasons for deadheading. Another reason is we want new blooms. It sporulates on decaying foliage. I have found it is not good to be growing bedding plants like geraniums nearby, because geraniums seem to harbor a lot of botrytis. Deadhead the bushes regularly. We got a problem. A good friend of mine who retired a few years ago from Penn State did a study in a greenhouse, and in his greenhouse, he found that botrytis started to develop resistance to fungicides in just 3 days. So fungicide resistance can develop very quickly with botrytis. Botrytis and many other fungi can also cause petal spots, also known as ghost spotting. I use the term ghost spotting with my students because they won't remember petal spot, but ghost spotting, for some reason, they remember. It's always associated with rainfall, very difficult to control. Fungicides are ineffective because it's usually wet, and petals have very poorly formed vascular systems, so it's hard for systemic fungicides to move into them at a level where we could get control. If it's going to be raining near when it is soon going to be time for you to exhibit roses, if you're one of the people who do that, putting some kind of bucket. I remember when I first moved to Tennessee many years ago, May that year was very, very wet, and I just walked into my first rose show. The roses were a disaster, to be honest with you. They were beaten by rain. But when the show had been judged and the roses were on the table, the table had just the queen of show, the king, the court. They were beautiful, and they were all by the same man. His name was Clyde Chappell, and what Clyde had done was he had gone to Kentucky Fried Chicken and bought 300 of their chicken buckets, and he had put them on tomato sticks, and any flower he thought had a chance that he might enter in the show, any bud, he had covered with that chicken bucket. And guess what? He won everything he entered. Okay, rose rust, serious problem in the western U.S. In the eastern U.S., usually has to be introduced in, usually does not overwinter here. Well, we have found it to overwinter a couple of times, but that's usually not the case. And I put this picture up here because that's the same cultivar of rose and crossful. And it has 2 different forms of rust, and it has, if we looked at the teliospores of the rust, they're not quite the same. Turns out it appears we have 2 different species floating around here. And so this can be, I have seen this destroy an entire rose garden in the east in 1 year when a person wasn't being careful about it. But the next year didn't have a bit. But I don't have any comfort to give as things keep getting warmer. Here are some roses that were at a nursery, and this was a display thing that they had at the nursery on Avery Island in Louisiana, and rust overwintered there because the roses did not lose their leaves. And of course, this thing can be moved around in interstate shipment, so it can show up really anywhere. Canker disease, something that is becoming more and more prominent. And if I had anything right now other than rosette that I would say is the bane of my existence as a pathologist, it would be canker issues on rose stems. There are a lot of fungi that have been attributed to causing cankers on roses. I don't believe it. I don't know how many of them actually are canker-causing fungi. Many of the fungi that are attributed to cankers on roses are things that are notorious about coming into a small canker that's been caused by something else and pushing the original pathogen out and then causing a big canker. But it couldn't have caused one at all unless that other thing had opened the door for it. But that's all we find is that secondary thing when the sample comes in. Cankers often become more prominent during winter months and early spring. The stems can be black, they can be brown, they can be gray, they can be yellow. Fungicides have not proven useful. I've been doing some thinking about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Sanitizing pruners between bushes. You should be doing that anyway for crown gall, but I think it's really critical to do when you with an alcohol or Lysol wipe between going from one bush to the next. There is a black bacterial canker that has been reported in the northwest United States during wet springs. I have seen people have sent me pictures of things that look like this, especially from the northeast. I have not received any samples where I could actually go through and look for cankers, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And once again, what would be helpful is sanitizing pruners. If it is bacterial and it's been diagnosed as bacterial, well, then some copper sprays may help. But I keep getting samples sent to me. One Rosarian, I'm not going to say who it is, that wouldn't be right, but he's won more rose prizes than any human in existence. So if you are an exhibitor, you know who I'm talking about. And a company sent me these canes just this past week. Both cases, I couldn't find any pathogen. If you look in the yellow cane, I peeled back where some of the yellow bark and just underneath the bark, the stem tissue looked healthy. The dormant buds were healthy. They were healthy in both cases. I could not isolate any pathogens from either one of these things. So what's going on? These things are becoming more prominent. Well, there's a number of things. First of all, there's no one in the United States, I can't find anyone in Europe, who is working with rose cane issues. I had planned to start a project on it this year. However, due to the pandemic backing things up on us last year, when I sat down and looked at everything that I needed to catch up on, there's not time to start a new project. I don't have the resources. So we will start a rose canker and hard to diagnose canker issues project, hopefully in 2022. I've just got too much stuff to catch up on from where the pandemic slowed us down last summer, and to get off my lab bench before I start doing something new. But stem issues are not easy. In both of these two cases, I had experts in other parts of the country look at these things, and they all said the same thing. We've seen it. We don't know what's causing these things. Well, it's going to be hard, probably, in my opinion, harder than rose rosette. But if I was idiotic enough to start working with rose rosette, we'll work with this one too. All right, armillaria root rot, and we're almost done. Armillaria root rot is a disease that you don't want. The roses usually start to die real quickly. There will be honey-colored mushrooms at the base. The roses lose vigor and they die. Usually they are associated where a tree, and it doesn't have to be a tree causing shade, but a big tree was cut down, or a big tree died, or a big shrub died, and its roots grew out to where the rose bed is. And as they start to die, a fungus that's always there, that's native and endemic, called armillaria, will become active on those dead and dying roots, and then they will move right in and kill roses as well, and hydrangeas and rhododendrons. In fact, they will kill any woody plant they come in contact with. Fungicides do not work. We have lost the ability in this country to use soil fumigants, so that is out. The only thing that I have found that is recommended was in a publication by the University of Illinois, and they suggested digging a 4-foot trench and lining it with sheet metal to stop the growth of this fungus. You can return to bed to ornamental grasses or herbaceous plants, But once you have this in a rose bed, that bed is pretty well done. Watermelons, that's what Baldo did when he had a problem. Crown gall, seeing a lot of that this year. Saw a lot of it last year on samples people sent me or pictures. It's caused by the bacterium Agrobacterium tumefaciens. It can cause large galls. I saw some pictures yesterday of galls on the ends of pruning cuts on roots when a person bought some bare root roses, and every pruning cut had a gall growing on it. And they were the little galls were about the size of a marble or a little smaller, but they were going to get bigger. Inspect your plants when you buy them before planting. If you have it in your soil, Agrobacterium tumefaciens is a soil inhabiting bacterium. That means once it's in soil, it's always there. And roots are always being injured as they grow through. As they grow through soil, they're coming in contact with little bits of sand and other hard things, and the root tips slough off. And that's a constant thing, and that's natural, it's normal. But there's always wounds being made as roots grow, and this bacterium can get in. And that's why it can spread over roots like what you see in that bottom picture. If you have it where you had a bush, I recommend removing 2 bushels of soil. That would be the amount of a large wheelbarrow, and putting new soil or whatever you grow your roses into that hole. Sanitize pruners often. You cannot do it often enough. Don't use Clorox because Clorox will corrode metal. Use Lysol, alcohol, something along that line. Rose mosaic, that's the name of the disease. It's caused by as many as 5 or 7 different viruses. Roses may have 1 virus. They can have 2 or 3 of those viruses in them. The symptoms include line patterns and ring spots. There's no cure for this. Some specialized labs might use a heat treatment or a apical stem, meristem rescue. But these are very tedious and technical type procedures, but if not followed just right with tissue culture, you will wind up killing the bush or the buds, and so that's not helpful. Plants can be stunted and have smaller blooms. Sometimes the damage that way is not very detectable, but I assure you they are slightly smaller than plants that don't have it. Root knot nematode, caused by the genus of nematodes mildew. I've got several samples in the last year out of the deep south on this. It can be hard to control. I told one person they had it so bad that I'd pull all the roses up. They were in a very hot and sunny location, and I said, put clear plastic, wet the bed, work it up, wet it down, put clear plastic over it, leave the plastic down for the entire summer, solarize the bed, and after several months, you will have killed all your weed seed and all the nematodes too. And then you can come back with roses. There are some biological control products that contain the fungus Phacelamyces. It's not legal in all states, may be useful. The literature I've read on this product sounds very encouraging, but I've never met anyone who's actually used it and been satisfied with control. Not saying they don't exist, I just haven't met them. Rose rosette. Well, you probably heard me talk on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Rose rosette can kill roses. It's spread by aphid mites. There are a lot of symptoms. If you're interested in rose rosette, some of the handouts, and we'll talk about that in a minute, will help you with it. It is spread by an aphid mite, Polycoptes fructiphilus. That's what it looks like. It's microscopic. You can't see it with a small hand lens. But rose rosette, both the virus and the mites can be moved on roses from anywhere in the country to anywhere else. There is no comfort to give. Some of the large rose growing areas in California had never had a problem with this, but then it was introduced in by moving some roses there from Ohio. And we've had problems show up in other parts of the East where it had not been reported on roses being brought from somewhere else. But once it gets to a place, it's going to be spread by these mites that just float in air currents. And, you know, as the one man there is saying, looks like a drifter blowing into town. Well, that's exactly what these mites do after they've been introduced into a location. So when you see it, what do you want to do? Get rid of the bush, if at all possible. The time for acting is not when you get a rosette, because when you get a rosette, the mite populations are 40 to 80 times higher than they are on foliage that is not a rosette on the same bush. So we don't ever want those rosettes to get like that. Get them out. If for some reason you can't dig up the bush, get those rosettes out, because that's where most of your mites are. Now, some people keep asking me, why don't we recommend miticides? Well, we have some and we know they work, but when we were using them, we were doing it as proof of concept. But there's all kind of questions. When should we start using miticides? Is the time to use miticides the same in all parts of the country? When should we stop using miticides? We have different miticides we do know that work. Do we have the same spray application intervals? In other words, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, for all of them? Or do some of them have to be used more often, or can some be used less? These are all questions that need to be answered before we start recommending miticides. This was just a little study that was done last year in Knoxville, in which we were looking to see when do mite populations begin to increase. Well, this was in the 4th wettest June in Knoxville history. Mite populations are suppressed by rainfall. So is that true for a more quote unquote normal year? We don't know. It's going to take a lot of work in a lot of locations and in a lot of different states. And I'd be doing that right now. We are going to be doing some of that in Shreveport this year. But the whole issue is, well, as a university research professor, we're used to operating budgets right on the edge of disaster. That's where we seem to always be. So how much we do on this? Well, it depends on how much money we can find. But one thing that I am encouraged about is resistance to rosette. We've identified some roses that are immune. Unfortunately, they are not roses I would want in my flower bed, and I'm pretty doggone tolerant about what I'll grow. Many of the more purists would not touch them with a 10-foot pole. But we have preliminary research that has identified a locus that controls symptom expression and virus titer, but it's preliminary. We got a lot more work to do on that. It costs a lot of money, but that doesn't mean we're stopping. I'll be screening many little plants this year for resistance to rosette that are babies that have a parent that we have found that we cannot infect with the virus. The virus, we can't detect the virus in them. They have no symptoms. They're not something you want in your yard. They look like they almost look like peanuts. But the thing is, we cross them with roses we do want, and this may take several generations, but we are working as hard and as fast as we can. The time to be doing this is now, because this is not something that's done in a year or two. It takes years. And we've got a problem, and I hate to mention this, but I'm going to. You can make a difference in the fight for rosette disease resistance You can Google GoFundMe Rose Rosette. Every penny, and there's a video you can watch. Paul Zimmerman's on it. Dave Byrne and Kevin Onk at Texas A&M. They're smart guys. And then I'm on it as well. But every penny that is raised, and that is a charity site, so it's tax deductible, and every penny that's raised goes into resistance breeding for Rose Rosette. Okay, today's handouts, we're done. Today's handouts for class, well, there are 4 of them. They are on the rose.org site under CR resources, so you can go there and download them. They are all, or you can email me at mwindham@utk.edu if for some reason you can't find them at rose.org, and I'm happy to send them to you. And so they're all PDFs, and so you can download and print them if you wish to. And with that, we're done. And so, by the way, when it is sunny like this morning, if you are coming off of I-40 on Rockport Mountain and you're facing Knoxville, you will see that East Tennessee really is big orange country. Go big orange. And with that, I'm going to stop.